All right, everybody, welcome back to Introduction to Multicultural Literatures of the United States. I am going to pick up this lecture right where I left off the last one. I had ended by reading you a somewhat mysterious poem by Gertrude Stein called Susie Asado. And then I said that I would begin the next lecture by reading through, first of all, by giving you some hints and some tips for reading, especially poetry, for reading difficult texts that you might not immediately understand, particularly short ones such as poems. Most of the novels we're going to read in this course are a little more straightforward than a lot of the poems we're going to read. Maybe the last two novels are a little less straightforward than the first three, but I think by then you'll be ready to handle them. Poetry is sometimes more intimidating to students and just objectively a little bit more difficult to understand, especially poetry coming out of that modernist movement and the movements that were subsequent to modernism that we'll look at in this course. And you'll recall the idea behind modernism was rejecting traditional ways of doing things, of making art, of writing literature, of writing poetry. So poetry that comes out of that modernist movement is often doing its own thing in its own way, and you have to sort of let it show you what it's doing. So if I were going to give you 3 tips for reading poetry, especially kind of difficult poetry, I would say number 1, read it out loud. Often poetry is hard to understand if you're just reading it with your eye. Often poetry, and this isn't even just true of modernist poetry, but of all poetry, is often meant to be experienced by your ear. You're meant to hear it, to hear how it sounds. So if you're able to read it out loud, read it to your roommate, read it to your family, whatever. If you are able to do that, I think that will show you some things about it that you wouldn't necessarily get if you were just reading it silently. So read it out loud, number 1. Number 2, poems are short. A lot of the poems, we're going to read a few longer poems in this course, a few poems that are longer than a page, though even those aren't going to be longer than, say, three pages or so. But most poems that we're going to read in this course are short, are even shorter than just a page long. So I would say read it more than once. Read it twice, read it 3 times, and pay that kind of attention to it, because when you read it the first time, you kind of don't really know what it's going to be all about until you get to the end, and then you can start again with the end in mind, and you can read different parts, emphasize different parts. So read it out loud, read it more than once. And then number 3, and that's the purpose of the image on the slide. This image on the slide is Susie Asado in my copy of the anthology of 20th century American literature that is the optional text for this course. And what you'll notice, don't worry if you can't read what I've written. It's not the point that you read what I've written. The point is, look what I've written. I've written all over this poem. I've written almost on every line. And so I would say annotate your poetry. Take notes on your poetry. This works for fiction too. Don't be afraid to write in your book, or if you want to sell your book later, maybe write in a notebook, or if you're reading on a screen, maybe type up some notes, or if you're using a Kindle or a tablet, often there'll be features where you can type up some notes there. But whether you're writing or typing or reading in print or reading on a screen, I would say don't just read, also write. Write alongside the writer you're reading. Write in response to the writer you're reading. And often when you kind of set yourself that task that you're going to write, and what have I written here? Mostly I've written not my reactions necessarily, but kind of explanations of what I think different things mean. So, for instance, I wrote, Susie Asado as a flamenco dancer Stein had seen in Spain, which is information I had looked up. Or I wrote, explanations of what I thought the lines meant. Sometimes, if you don't know what a word means, you should underline it, look it up, write down what it means. So that's my other advice, is don't just be a passive reader, be an active reader. And being an active reader is often being a writer. Write back to your author. Take that initiative. And so I just post this to demonstrate that that's what I do. That's what I do when I'm faced with a poem that I don't understand. Because when I first taught this class, I ordered that anthology, This was just a few years ago, and I had actually never read this poem by Gertrude Stein. I had never come across it. I just read it because it was in this anthology that I had ordered for the class. And when I first read it, I had the same reaction you did. What is this? What is going on here? And so I wrote my way to understanding, and I suggest that you do the same. Now, I don't understand every line of this poem. I don't think you're meant to understand every line of this poem, but you can begin to make some sense of it if you look at some lines that you might understand. I propose that we read this poem from the bottom up. I want to look at the second to last line. The second to last line of this poem is, "What is a nail? A nail is unison." And I think that is the clearest line in this poem. I think I wrote in the margin, "A proposition of perfect philosophical sense and clarity," which you don't often get from Gertrude Stein. So I mentioned that Gertrude Stein's professor when she was in college was the American philosopher and psychologist William James. And the idea in philosophy that William James is most associated with is called pragmatism. And the idea of pragmatism is that the meaning of a philosophy is not in what it says, but in the effects it has. So the word pragmatism refers to like the practical effects something has. So the meaning of a philosophy is not what it says, it's what it does. And I argue that what is a nail is unison, is a pragmatist philosophical argument. So what is a nail? Well, if the meaning of a nail was just what the object was, you'd say, well, it's this piece of metal, and it's flat on one end and it's sharp on the other, and that's what a nail is. But really, what does a nail do? You use a nail to join two things together. You use a nail to nail, let's say, two pieces of wood together when you're building, or you put a nail into a wall so you can hang something on it. So you can, let's say you hang up a painting, you're joining the painting to the wall with the nail. You're joining the two pieces of wood together when you hammer the nail between them. So the word unison means joining, means coming together. So what is a nail? A nail is unison. Why is a nail unison? Because unison is what a nail does. Unison is the effect a nail has on the world. So I propose we read the rest of the poem with that idea in mind, that the meaning of something is not in what it is, but what it does. The meaning of this poem is not necessarily some secret subtext that it has, but it's what I call in my heading here on the slide, the poem is trying to be or to enact a certain emotional reaction that is its occasion. So the poem is an event. The poem is not a thing. It's not an inert meaning. It's a happening. It's an event. It's an act, and we need to kind of participate in that act. I hope that makes sense to you. So then what, in that sense, if we think of it that way, is the poem about? Well, let's remember the scenario. The scenario is that Gertrude Stein saw this flamenco dancer in Spain. So let's say the sort of situation the poem is presenting to us is that the speaker is watching a flamenco dancer. And these are the impressions of that speaker. These are her impressions. So what are her impressions then? Well, we have this exclamation almost. It doesn't use an exclamation point, but it feels exclamatory. Sweet, 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 sweet tea. And we hear that three times in the poem. Now, number one, that's wordplay. So it's both describing sweet tea, this very sweet drink that's sugary and pleasurable to drink, but also it's a play on the term of endearment, sweetie. So the speaker is both addressing Susie Asado as sweetie, and I think characterizing the act of watching her as like a kind of metaphor for drinking sweet tea. And she goes on to describe Susie Asado, she says, a lean on the shoe. This means slips hers. So I think what's going on there is Gertrude Stein wants to describe the act of dancing in a way that makes you remember what the act of dancing actually is. She could have said, Susie Asado is dancing. But no, she defamiliarizes our sense of dance to remember what it is. A lean on the shoe, slips. So she leans on her shoe, then her feet kind of slip. That's what it looks like when she's dancing. Slips hers. And that's a pun too, because she's dancing in slippers, but she's also slipping across the floor. Note that Gertrude Stein doesn't care about traditional grammar. This means slips hers. That doesn't really make any grammatical sense. We have slips, and slips are verbs where a noun should be, as the object of the verb means. What is the part of speech of hers? Who knows? Gertrude Stein is not concerned with traditional grammar. She's not concerned with conventional grammar. She's concerned with how this feels. And it's a very metamorphic experience. In the line above, she describes Susie Asado as a told treasure. This is more wordplay. So she's a told treasure. That is, told means sort of, she's heard she's a treasure. It's been said that she's a treasure. So she's this kind of true treasure, this well-known treasure. But then she's a told, so she's the something that somebody tells about. We might say Susie Asado is the subject of this poem, très sure, which is, if you spell it different, French, very sure, very certain. So she's very certainly famous. She's very certainly told about. And we see that because Susie Asado, which is a told très sure. Now, when you're talking about a person, you would say whom, not which. Which is for a thing. But Susie Asado is this kind of event, this phenomenon. So she takes this impersonal pronoun which. Look at the line below, slips hers. When the ancient light gray is clean, it is yellow, it is a silver cellar. Now, I don't actually know what that means, but what I do know is it's metamorphic, it's transformative. We go from gray to yellow to silver. So this experience of watching Susie Asado dance is an experience of constant transformation, of constant metamorphosis, and Gertrude Stein's language has to change, transform, and metamorphose to kind of keep up with it. Look at the next line. This is a please. This is a please. When I got to that line, it's where I really understood this poem, because those feel like there's a lot of humor in this poem, but that feels like a very earnest sentiment. The speaker is kind of pleading, is yearning, is asking, is begging for something. And I think that's a great evocation of desire. This is a poem about watching something and watching someone that makes you feel desire, and you feel this yearning. This is a please. And then look at the next line. There are the seds to jelly. So what is said turns to jelly. Language turns to jelly. And I think if you think about the way we talk about feeling desire, feeling sort of erotic longing, it's very common to talk about, your stomach melts, your heart melts, or whatever, this feeling of, this is a poem, it's an experimental poem, but it's about a real experience that a lot of people, or maybe just all people, have when you're watching something and it incites desire, it incites yearning, and all your words turn to jelly, and your insides turn to jelly, and you say, this is a please, this is a please. These are the wets, these say the sets. I don't really know what that means. I think that it has something to do with characterizing an erotic experience. And then they leave a crown to inky. Inky is short for incubus. Now, this is a reference. Sometimes poems tell you what they mean by referring to something outside themselves. And this is a good example. An incubus is a figure in Greek mythology. In Greek mythology, there were two sort of demon-like creatures, an incubus and a succubus. And a succubus was female and an incubus was male. And these were demons that were said to, essentially, it's kind of an unpleasant myth, to sort of sexually assault people at night. Generally, the way the myth worked was the succubus would assault a male person and the incubus would assault a woman. And sometimes people say, well, this is kind of like a mythological explanation of the experience of sleep paralysis, for instance. But I think what Gertrude Stein is doing, I think with this reference, things are beginning to come together. Because we have a female poet, and we can perhaps then assume, it's not always a safe assumption, but here maybe we can assume a female speaker watching a female dancer. And the only reference you get in this poem to a heterosexual male-female erotic experience is this reference to a male demon who commits the act of sexual assault. And that demon is kind of cut down in the poem by being referred to by this cutesy name, Inky. So I think what's happening in this poem is Gertrude Stein is essentially writing an act, an event of female queer desire and leaving out the story of male desire for women. So first of all, providing us with an illusion that makes it clear that that's not always a good story, and then even there removing from it a sense of like deep evil and just calling it Inky. Oh, that's, leave a crown to Inky. Inky has his crown of the heteronormative, but what's happening here is much more interesting than that. So Gertrude Stein gives us the story of female desire excluding that story of male desire. We might contrast this with Gertrude Stein's friend Picasso's painting La Demoiselle d'Avignon. That was a story of, in many ways, it was a radical and a revolutionary painting for what it did to the art of painting, but in other ways, it was traditional. And one of the things traditional about it was that the entire painting was organized around the gaze, the look, the projection of the male painter. And we sort of got, again, we had for many centuries, this male perspective on the female body. Gertrude Stein gives us something different here. She gives us the story of female desire without that male organizing vision. So that, I think, I'm not going to try to explain the rest of the poem. After Inky is short for incubus, everything between Inky is short for incubus and what is a nail, I'm a bit unclear about. I don't understand exactly what the pups are doing, where the pups and the bobo link come in. There's a reference to an old comic strip when she says a pot is a beginning of a rare bit of trees. There was a comic strip, a very experimental comic strip in the early 20th century called Dreams of the Rare Bit Fiend. And it was a comic strip just detailing this person's dreams. It was very surreal. And so I know that because I regularly teach another class at another school called The History of Comics. But I don't actually, other than the dream aesthetic, I don't quite know what's going on there. So also, you might want to write your paper on this poem, so I don't want to try to explain every line. But I think we can see, if you think about what is a nail and you think about Inky is short for incubus, those for me are the key lines about the meaning. The poem is trying to recreate the event of this longing experience of the speaker watching Susie Asado, and in so doing is trying to write the story of female desire without that male subjectivity within it. And that's what it means, but don't forget the emotions. This is a please, this is a please, there are the seds to jelly. The poem is trying to convey more than meaning, I think, this emotion of yearning, of longing, of the transformation in psychology, in subjectivity, and in language that this act of longing occasions. So I hope that made a certain sense. This is a very much a modernist poem. I think this is an exemplary modernist poem that we can use as a a clear idea of what this movement in the arts was about. So with that, I want to leave behind Gertrude Stein, and I want to turn now to one more poem, which is Langston Hughes's The Negro Speaks of Rivers. But before we do that, I think we need a little bit more context, because we were talking about modernism in a big sense, and we were talking about modernism as an international movement in the arts, and it very much was, and it encompassed many different national traditions. There were also many sub movements within modernism that were sometimes, different movements in the arts. When we talked about Picasso, I mentioned that he was in this school of painting called Cubism. Ezra Pound had a school of poetry called Imagism. So there would always be these little sort of sub-formations of different aesthetic movements within the broader movement of modernism. But then there would also be kind of site-specific or cultural specific sub-movements within modernism. So you would talk about, the Irish revival in Ireland, for instance, which I'll have occasion to mention in a minute. But I think one of the big ones in the United States is the sub-movement of modernism called the Harlem Renaissance. And you've probably heard of this before, so I'm not going to be too long in my explanation. But the Harlem Renaissance was a movement in African American literature, art, and music, lasting from the 1910s to about the 1930s. And its context, the thing that sort of made it happen, was this historical movement called the Great Migration. So in the early 20th century, up to 300,000 African Americans left the rural South to go to the urban North for, I think, two main reasons. Number one, in the South, after the Civil War and then the abandonment by the United States government of attempts to sort of ban racism in the South and economically integrate African American and white populations in the South, there was then the Jim Crow laws. So there was a legal regime in the South of segregation, and also accompanied by extrajudicial kind of terrorism in the form of lynchings and the activities of the Ku Klux Klan. And so for that reason, there was African Americans had an interest in getting out of there, that it was a very bad political environment. And the point isn't that there was no racism in the North. There was, but there wasn't the same kind of fully sort of both legal and extra legal forms of almost terrorism of the population in the same way. So it seemed like there might be a greater opportunity for political freedom in the North. And then the other thing is moving from the rural South to the urban North. So this is a period in which America is, becoming a very industrial nation. So there's jobs opening up in industries in the northern cities, whereas a lot of the basis of the southern economy had become less important by the end of the 19th and the early 20th century. So to escape that regime of Jim Crow in the South and then to find economic opportunity in the North, you have the Great Migration. So this leads to many cities in the North and the Midwest and the West Coast gaining an African American population that they had not had before. And Harlem, this neighborhood in New York, becomes a center of African American cultural life that is receiving, not just people who are going to work in industrial jobs, so not just working class African Americans, but it also becomes a center of middle class, of bourgeois African American life. And so when you have a strong, robust middle class in a community, they can support the arts, they can support literature. So you have this famous nightlife in Harlem where, the innovations that are happening in jazz music are enacted, and you also have an unprecedented efflorescence of African American publishing and African Americans writing more poetry and novels and essays than they had probably had the opportunity to do before. And not just that, but also now that they can assume that a substantial part of their readership and their audience is also African American. There wasn't, before this, in the 19th century, you would have African American writers and they knew that they had African American readers, but publishing was so dominated, was so white dominated, and the sense of who the audience was so white dominated. There wasn't a sense that black writers could write to a black audience or on black subjects without having to be sort of conciliatory to white audiences. So that's the Harlem Renaissance kind of in a nutshell. It did kind of coincide with a big economic boom in the United States in the 1920s. And then when there was the economic crash with the Depression and World War II, that led to it coming, I think, to an end in a lot of ways. So it was this early 20th century, 1910s to 1930s movement. One important document of the Harlem Renaissance was a book edited by the philosopher ALAIN Locke. And the book was called The New Negro. This was often said to be what you saw in the Harlem Renaissance. So just a brief word on terminology. The word Negro was the preferred form of address for African Americans in the early 20th century. Then later, after the 1960s, that term fell out of use and is probably now considered, at least if used by white people, offensive. But that was the word that was used and preferred by African American writers and thinkers in this period. And so they often used it to refer to the African American community in their work. So we'll have to use it to, where they use it, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend you using it in your own voice in the 21st century. So the new Negro was this idea that after the Great Migration with the Harlem Renaissance, there was a kind of new birth of African American culture. And ALAIN Locke, who is a very important thinker, he was, I believe, the first African American Rhodes Scholar. He studied in England and Germany. He received a PhD in philosophy in 1918, and he taught at the historically black college Howard for most of his life. But he was not just an academic philosopher. He was also interested in promoting and explaining African American culture. So he does this anthology, he edits this anthology, The New Negro, in 1925, which contains poems, stories, and essays by people who maybe weren't all that well known at the time, but would later be considered major African American writers, like Langston, Hughes, Claude McKay, Jean Toomer, and Zora Neale Hurston. But he also wrote an introduction to this book that I think we can see as a manifesto for the Harlem Renaissance. Modernism in general is a great age of manifestos because, as I mentioned, when you have this, the whole point of modernism is that tradition has kind of fallen away, that we can't easily rely on tradition to guide us anymore. And so if you can't rely on tradition to guide you anymore, you need to explain what you are going to use to guide you. So political movements, artistic movements, and cultural movements had to create these manifestos. I mean, Ezra Pound wrote like a manifesto every 5 years, every time he sort of came up with a new poetry idea. So modernism was a great age of manifestos, and I think that just as Pound's Imagism manifesto is a great one, I think Locke's introduction to the volume The New Negro is a great one. And I want to just read a few excerpts from this introduction because I think it will give us a good sense, a good idea of some of the new ideas that were in the air in the early 20th century. And what I think is really interesting about this document is Locke doesn't really, he sort of presents a couple of different ideas about where African American culture can go in this moment of the Harlem Renaissance, in this moment where it's new. And they're not really, they can't sort of all be true. But I think that's okay. I'm not accusing him of contradicting himself. What I'm saying is everything was kind of up in the air in this moment. And he was pointing to several different ways and shapes things could take, particularly for African Americans. But I think we can also think about this in the broader concept of multiculturalism more generally, that if you are a non-dominant culture, a culture that has been marginalized, that has been oppressed from the point of view of a dominant culture, then where should you go when you begin to sort of resist? What should you do? In what terms should you resist? And Locke himself makes a lot of comparisons between African Americans and other groups that had been marginalized and oppressed. And I have chosen 3 excerpts where I think he gives 3 different ideas of where African Americans can go intellectually and culturally to resist this marginalization and this oppression. And I think we're going to see these 3 options come up again and again in the course, as far as whether it's African American groups, Native American groups, Jewish American groups. They will sort of choose one of these options or explore the tensions between them. So the first one is, he says, previous to the 20th century, the chief bond between African Americans has been that of a common condition rather than a common consciousness, a problem in common rather than a life in common. In Harlem, Negro life is seizing upon its first chances for group expression and self-determination. It is, or promises at least to be, a race capital. Then I want to skip down to the last line in the first paragraph on the left. Without pretense to their political significance, Harlem has the same role to play for the new Negro as Dublin has had for the new Ireland, or Prague for the new Czechoslovakia. So here's one option, he says. One option is that African Americans have, previous to the 20th century, been joined only by their common problem, which was first slavery and then the forms of oppression that followed from slavery. But that's not a very good or permanent basis for cultural unity. What you need is to actually have cultural unity, which is to say you need to have cultural values in common. And those need to be centered somewhere. That group expression and self-determination needs to be centered somewhere. And he says Harlem is now the center of a positive basis, an affirmative basis for African American culture. And he compares it to countries in Europe that have become independent, whether that's Ireland, which became independent in the early 20th century after throwing off the British Empire, or cultures or countries in Central and Eastern Europe that became newly independent when, like, the Austro-Hungarian Empire and other empires in Central and Eastern Europe had collapsed. So you'll note the implication. The implication is that Black Americans constitute their own country, and that Harlem is the capital of their own country. So I think what we see in this first option, what he's presenting as a first option for African Americans, is what will, I think, later be called like Black nationalism. The view of African Americans as a nation within the nation, with their own separate culture, their own separate communities, and their own essentially separate country within the broader country of the United States. So let's call that nationalism. That's the first option. The second option he implies in my second paragraph on the left. He says, more and more we see an intelligent realization of the great discrepancy between the American social creed and the American social practice forces upon the Negro the taking of the moral advantage that is his. In other words, this is a different way of looking at the situation. In this way of looking at the situation, the American creed is democracy and freedom. But American practice has been to deny democracy and freedom to African Americans. So there's this big contradiction in America. This promise of freedom and democracy, and then this denial of freedom and democracy to African Americans. This gives African Americans, Locke says, a moral advantage. The moral advantage is by fighting for their own freedom and democracy, they are the most American Americans of all. There is no one more American than African Americans, because they are fighting to realize the promise that white Americans have only hypocritically given as the American creed. So, in this sense, African Americans are not a separate nation within the nation. They're not a separate country. They are the essence and the center of the country, the greatest Americans of all. So, we might call this the Americanist option, to treat African Americans as the most typical, the most honest, the most idealistic, and the truest Americans. You'll note that these two things are in tension. The nationalist ideal, African Americans are a separate country, a separate nation, versus the Americanist ideal, African Americans as the center, the essence of America. So nationalism, Americanism. Then number 3 is, I'm just going to sum this up. It's very long. But he says, let's just say this way. He says, the pulse of the Negro world has begun to beat in Harlem. A Negro newspaper carrying news material in English, French, and Spanish gathered from all quarters of America, the West Indies, and Africa has maintained itself in Harlem for over 5 years. Then he talks about Pan-African congresses and people who are interested in Black Americans having future cooperative developments of Africa. In other words, if Harlem was the capital of the Black nation within the nation of America in the first example, it here becomes a world capital of the Black diaspora. That is, those people of African descent wherever they live, whether that be in Africa itself, in the Caribbean, or in the United States. So Harlem here becomes the center of a global Black movement, a Pan-African movement that involves all Black people the world over. And in that case, then, I'm going to call this option internationalism, where people within the United States who belong to groups that are marginalized or oppressed or dominated form alliances with other people that they have some common cultural or ethnic relation to outside the United States to form an international grouping. He also makes a connection with Zionism, that is to say, which was the movement of the Jewish diaspora to center themselves on a national homeland in the Middle East, in what would become Israel. And so Israel would become the center of the global Jewish population. Similarly, he proposes Harlem becomes the capital of the global Black population. So internationalism. Now, as I said, I think that you can put these three things in conversation with each other, but I don't think you can fully subscribe to all three, or even just two of the three. I think they're in a kind of tension with each other. He's saying, on behalf of African Americans, we could either consider ourselves a separate nation within the United States, we could consider ourselves the sort of leaders of the United States, considered as a multicultural polity, a multicultural state, or we can consider ourselves part of an international movement that has no real interest in either being exclusively African American or being exclusively American. So nationalism, Americanism, internationalism. I want you to be thinking of these three options. I think we're going to see writers thinking about these three options throughout the course as options you can take if you belong to an oppressed or a marginalized or a subordinated cultural group. Okay? So that's why I introduced this here. I also introduce it to give some wider context for the Harlem Renaissance movement. And finally, for the poem I now want to look at, the last poem I want to look at in the Modernism unit, which is Langston Hughes's perhaps most famous poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So Langston Hughes just briefly lived from 1902 to 1967. He was born in Mississippi, in Joplin, Mississippi. Sorry, I have this information on a note card, and I can't tell if it's Mississippi or not. But that's fine. His parents divorced, and he was raised by his maternal grandmother in Kansas. And so his father had moved to Mexico. So he was raised by his mother's mother. But he would sometimes visit his mother because she moved to Detroit, and he would sometimes visit his father in Mexico. So right away, he has experience of the South, the North, the Midwest, and then outside the United States of Mexico. And this idea of traveling, of wandering, would kind of characterize much of his life. He went to school. He started school in Columbia for university in New York, but he left to join the Merchant Marine and traveled as a merchant sailor to Europe. And then he began writing poetry at a very young age. So you just heard me say he was born in 1902. He wrote The Negro Speaks of Rivers in 1921. So he was a very young man. He was just a teenager when he wrote this very famous, brilliant poem. So he had this kind of almost prodigy aspect, this early genius. And then he ends up living in Harlem during the Harlem Renaissance and publishing poetry in the New Negro Anthology and in other black journals that were being published out of Harlem. And he publishes his first poetry collection, The Weary Blues, in 1926. And he becomes a pretty famous and popular poet. His poetry went through a couple of phases. In the 1920s, his poetry was interested in articulating the African American experience and African American culture kind of in Harlem and in the Harlem Renaissance. Then in the 30s, when the Depression comes, he takes a radical turn, and Hughes becomes a radical of the left, a sympathizer with communism. And much of his poetry of this period is kind of very exclamatory political verse. And some of his most famous poems of this period, like the one that says, "Let America be America again," sort of stem from this leftist sense of the need for a radical transformation in American and global culture. However, he lived, past that period, and in the 50s, he kind of recanted that early interest in communism and tried to rehabilitate, because in the 50s, so just a brief overview, in the 30s, a lot of writers turned to communism because it looked like the world, with the Great Depression, it looked like capitalism had utterly failed, and so they turned to communism as an alternative. Other writers like Pound and perhaps Stein turned to fascism as an alternative, but in any case, it looked like capitalism and liberal democracy had collapsed. Then after World War II, after the United States defeats fascism in an alliance with the Soviet Union, then there's the Cold War, in which the United States construes itself as being at war with communism. We'll discuss this at length in a few weeks. And so a lot of poets and artists and thinkers and painters and stuff who had adopted communism in the 30s had to kind of take that back, because communists were being looked upon with deep suspicion. And also, to be fair, the many failures of the communist system had also become more widely publicized. So I don't think they were just doing it opportunistically. I think they sincerely thought they had been mistaken to support communism in the era of Joseph Stalin. So that's just a brief overview. Langston Hughes wrote this poem in that early moment where he was interested not so much in capital P politics and capital E economics, but more in questions of how to articulate a particular sense of black culture. And he says he wrote a famous manifesto, like all the writers of this time, in the 1920s, called "The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain." And Rita Dove quotes it in the introduction to the anthology of 20th century American poetry. And I want to read you what Hughes says there. He says, "We younger Negro artists now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they aren't, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful, and ugly too. If colored people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. We build our temples for tomorrow as strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain free within ourselves." So this is similar to what I was saying earlier about the moment of the Harlem Renaissance being the moment where African Americans don't have to write in a way to appeal to or to conciliate a white audience. There's no longer that expectation, because there's now first of all, an African American audience in Harlem, and even when you think about, the fact that there are white readers too, there are white readers by the 1920s that are interested in hearing about the unique aspects of African American culture. So I think he's saying there, we're going to express our culture, and also we individual artists are going to express our individuality, and we're not going to concern ourselves with what kind of social effects or political effects that'll have. Because you notice he says, if black readers don't like the work of black writers, we don't care about that either. We're expressing ourselves. This is a moment for self-expression. And for expression of cultural values, not for necessarily trying to placate or conciliate any particular audience. So let's look at an example of the poetry that Hughes writes when he's composing this manifesto. So he writes this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. So you'll note the title is in the third person. He's telling us that the speaker of the poem is black. And I don't necessarily say African American because it's not limited to African American. The speaker of this poem, as you'll see, is, I think, a person who has been a member of the African diaspora. So let me just read the poem and then I'll say a few words about it. I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when the dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. All right, so you'll notice in my screenshot I have the date of the poem as 1926. That was when it was first published in a book, in the Weary Blues, but it was first published in a journal earlier than that in 1921. So let me make a couple remarks. First of all, this poem is written in free verse, and the lines are sometimes very short, they're sometimes very long, so Hughes is much more interested in just establishing his own rhythm than in using some prefabricated meter. So he uses this free verse. You'll notice something else. This is a good poem to demonstrate why we should talk about the speaker and not confuse the speaker of a poem with the poet. The speaker of this poem is obviously not necessarily a single individual, and it's not necessarily Langston Hughes. The speaker of this poem seems to be a kind of representative of a very long history, going back to when dawns were young. Okay, going back to when the world was ancient. So this is not necessarily a single person. This is kind of a spirit. And what do we know about this spirit? What rivers has this spirit seen? Well, this spirit has seen the Euphrates, which is in the Middle East in present-day Iraq, and often considered, I think, the first river along which human civilization was known to flourish. I think that's true. This speaker has seen the Congo River, which is in the middle of Africa. This speaker has seen the Nile River, which is in northern Africa. And this speaker has seen the Mississippi River, which is in the southern United States. And what I think what this geography tells us is that this is a speaker that has seen rivers along which human civilization has flourished that aren't in Europe. Okay, we can almost trace, think of the world map. We start at the Euphrates, then we go down, we avoid Europe, we go down into the middle of Africa, then up to northern Africa, and then we still avoid Europe and we go to the southern United States, particularly those places where African Americans were enslaved but also built an independent culture. So this is a speaker that is speaking of let's say, the civilizations of people of color and the rivers they have grown up around. Just as Susie Asado gives us a poem in which the female poet writes the story of female desire without men in it, so this poem gives us a story in which the African American poet writes history without centering Europe, without Europe in it. So we have this kind of collective consciousness of a kind of African or near to African civilization that this poem offers us. And I think that is the kind of political and cultural meaning of the poem, this attempt to create a culture without centering European culture. And we know that because of the names of the rivers we're given. And to the extent that the speaker of this poem might be identified with Langston Hughes, we might say that Langston Hughes is trying to create a consciousness for African Americans of this very deep history that goes back to the ancient world, that goes back to the ancient Euphrates, that goes back to the great civilizations of Africa. One more thing I want to point out, though. He says, I built my hut near the Congo. I raised the pyramids by the Nile. And when Abraham Lincoln went down to New Orleans, that would have been during a period when slavery was still in place in the United States. So, in other words, this speaker was always a worker. This speaker built a hut rather than living in a palace. This speaker didn't order the pyramids to be built, but built the pyramids. And this speaker was presumably enslaved in the 19th century in the United States. And I think here we can see the seeds of Langston Hughes's interest in Marxism and in communism, which I'll explain these ideologies later in the semester. But in short, what you need to know is they're very centered on the idea of the worker, that the motor of history is the laborer. It's the laborer who builds everything. So when this speaker speaks of the glories of past civilization, he might speak of their glories, but he also doesn't forget that those glories were built by workers, and it's the workers he identifies with. So not only is he kind of creating a consciousness of great, civilizations of color, of Pan-African civilizations, but there's also a political consciousness of the importance of labor within that. So this is a very complex poem in that way, with the complexity of the identity of the speaker and of the political argument being made. And he wrote this when he was 19. Okay, so I say that just to praise his great early genius and to maybe inspire your own ambition to write similarly great work at a young age. So that ends our discussion of poetry, though it does not end our discussion of the Harlem Renaissance, because what I want to do now, let's see, I started lecturing about 55 minutes ago, so I'm going to go for 10 or 15 more minutes. We're going to turn now to a novel. So we're going to read poetry in this course, and we're going to read fiction. And the novel picks up right where Langston Hughes leaves off, because it's a novel written by an African-American writer who was living in Harlem in the 20s and writing out of and about the Harlem Renaissance movement. So in that sense, we're not changing topics. So I want you to keep in mind ALAIN, Locke, and Langston Hughes as we go into this novel. However, we are changing the literary form. We are changing genre. So poetry and fiction are two different types of literature. So while I want to carry on this discussion of the Harlem Renaissance, what I think it's important to do now is, just as I talked to you about the elements of poetry before we started reading poetry, I want to now pause and talk to you about the elements of fiction before we begin to read this novel. So fiction is a narrative that's made up, that is written in prose, usually. Fiction was often written in poetry in olden times. You might know the Odyssey. That might be the Odyssey is a book you probably read in high school. It's an ancient poem, a spoken poem that tells a fictional or mythical story. But in modern times, fiction is a a narrative that tends to be written in prose, and it's an imaginative, it's a made-up story. What are the elements of fiction? There are a couple different ones. This is these are all the ones I'm going to tell you, but there are more we could get into. But these are the ones I want to focus on now. So first of all, there's the setting. So that's the place or the places where the events of the work occur. Now, setting is also important in poetry. We just spent a whole conversation talking about how, the rivers Langston Hughes mentions in his poem are crucial to its meaning. But setting, sometimes poetry kind of de-emphasizes the setting. Where is Susie Asado set? I don't know. Some place where Susie Asado is dancing. We don't get a lot of information. Fiction tends to emphasize its location. And that's very true in the novel we're about to read, Quicksand, which takes place in many different settings. That's part of the point of the book, is we travel from setting to setting, many different places in the United States, and then we go to Europe, and then we come back to the United States, and we go from the south to the north. We go from New York to Copenhagen, and the different ways these settings are characterized in many ways is the meaning of the novel, these settings. So setting and how the author describes the setting, how the author characterizes the setting, what is emphasized, what is not. Is this a good place? Is this a bad place? What kind of words does the author use? What images does the author emphasize? Does the author use metaphors to compare elements of the setting to something else? Setting can be very, very important, and that will become clear to you when we talk about Quicksand with its multiplicity of settings. Next we have what I'm calling story or plot. So this seems very simple. So the story in fiction is what happens. What is the story about? What happens? But it's actually a very complicated thing, story. And there's whole schools of study in academia that talk about how we can think about story in fiction. The school of study is called narratology, kind of the study of narration. And I'm just going to give you a very basic distinction to keep in mind in this course. It's not going to be all that important yet. It'll become more important later. But I'm going to use very simple terms that were used in a book written in the 1920s by an English novelist called E.M. Forster. He wrote a novel called Aspects of the Novel, where he tried to suggest what a novel was and what its characteristics were. And he distinguished between story and plot. And he said story is just a chain of events. And his example is the king died and then the queen died. And he says that's just a chain of events. Plot is what those events have to do with each other, the events in their logical order. He says, so a story is the king died and then the queen died. A plot is the king died and then the queen died of grief. So the plot tells you what the events have to do with one another. So the actions narrated might be the story, but the order in which they're put so that we understand what they have to do with each other are the plot. And often what you'll find in fiction is that you're given the events a little bit out of order. So let me give you an example. I told you to start reading Quicksand today. We begin reading Quicksand with Helga Crane, who's our protagonist, our main character, being about, let's say, in her early or mid-20s. We don't begin with her childhood. We hear about her childhood later as she kind of flashes back to certain events in her childhood or to what her childhood was like. Now, if you just put the novel in the order of the story, you might begin with her childhood. But Nella Larson chooses to begin with Helga as an adult and then flashes back when it's important to tell us what her childhood was like and how that, made her the person she is as an adult. So the story is just the events. The plot is what they mean and the order in which the author gives it to us to convey what they mean. Like all these literary terms, that sounds incredibly abstract, and I think it will only become clear when we look at examples, but I just want to give you the words so that when I use the words, you'll understand them. All right, another very important thing in fiction is the point of view. Point of view is the identity or position of the narrator. There are traditionally three main types of points of view used in fiction. There are more than these, but the other ones are just tend to be used in experimental type of material. But mostly, if you pick up a novel, you will find one of these three. The first one is third person omniscient. That's when the narrator is a storyteller who is not part of the action and can enter any character's mind. That's where the idea of omniscience comes from. So you're reading a novel, it's being told to you by a narrator. Excuse me, the narrator uses the third person about the different characters and can enter the minds or speak from the point of view of many different characters. The next type of third person narration is called third person limited. This is when the narrator is a storyteller who is not part of the action but only enters one character's mind. And there's kind of a sub-term of this, which is focalization, when a third person narrator tells the story from a specific character's point of view. This is, I think, how we would characterize Quicksand. Quicksand has a third person narrator, but that third person narrator stays very close to Helga Crane and rarely, if ever, tells us what other characters are thinking. And even when the narrator does tell us what other characters are thinking, it seems to be what Helga thinks other characters are thinking. So we always have Helga's point of view. The novel is focalized through Helga. So that's third person limited. And then we have the other point of view, which is first person. The narrator is a character or actor in the narrative. The next novel we read in this course, The Martyred by Richard E. Kim, is first person. The narrator is the main character. Whereas in Quicksand, we have a third person narrator who narrates from the perspective of the main character. Third person omniscient would be a narrator who can enter the minds of many different characters, who can write from the point of view of many different characters. All right, so that's point of view. I already have been using the word character. That is the person or actors who feature in the work. I use the word main character. Most novels have, one character we can say is the protagonist, is the central character, and then the other characters are kind of secondary. How characters are created for us by authors, I think there's two main methods. One is direct characterization, when the narrator directly tells us about the character. You're going to see a lot of this in Quicksand. The narrator in Quicksand will spend a lot of time just telling us about Helga Crane and who she is. Another method is indirect characterization, when the narrator shows us the character's actions and thoughts and other characters' reactions to them. That will happen too in Quicksand. The next novel we're going to read, The Martyred, as I'm going to explain when we get to it, it's almost written like a play or like a movie, so we just get a lot of dialogue without narration. So there's a lot of indirect characterization in that book, because mostly we just see what the characters do and listen to what they say to each other, and there's not as much there's not as much direct characterization, whereas Quicksand has an enormous amount of direct characterization, that narrator just telling us who Helga Crane is and what she's thinking. Then finally, most of our poetry terms focused on language, and I haven't been focusing on language that much, but fiction also, it's very important to think about the language the author is using. So I'm going to sort of put that all under the heading of style. So that's the level, the tone, the register of language used in the work. Does the author speak in very simple terms, the way that the narrator of our next book, The Martyred, will do? Or does the author use very elevated, very poetic, or sometimes scientific, or just generally very educated vocabulary the way the narrator of Quicksand will? Does the author use a lot of metaphors, a lot of poetic language, or not? That is something to think about when you're reading fiction. What is the style? And again, I think once we've read Quicksand and then The Martyred, which are two books written in two very different styles, you'll see the difference this makes. All right, one more slide, because I have about 3 more minutes. So we're going to be reading Quicksand. I would urge you to read, at least, it's a very short book, so I'd urge you to read the first 2/3 for next week, for our next lecture anyway. And I will begin talking about the specifics of the text, the plot, and the characters, and I will look at some specific passages in the next lecture. So I just want to end this lecture by telling you who the author is. So who is Nella Larsen? She was born in Chicago in 1891 to a Danish immigrant mother and to a father from the Danish Virgin Islands. So he was a black man from the Virgin Islands in the Caribbean that were part of Denmark's kind of overseas empire. You might not think of Denmark having an empire, but they had a small one in that sense. So she has a connection to Danish culture on both sides, but her mother is white and her father is black, and this will be something that will be a theme in Quicksand. She was educated first as a nurse and then as a librarian, and she married a physicist named Elmer Imes in 1919. So she's had a kind of varied professional experience. She's familiar with science through her work as a nurse and through her being married to a physicist. She's also very familiar with the world of books and literature as being a librarian. And so, as I think I already mentioned, Quicksand is it's written in a very erudite, very educated, almost scholarly tone. So she has this very strongly educated background. She publishes 2 novels, Quicksand and Passing, back to back in 1928 and 1929. They're very well reviewed, very widely reviewed, and she wins a Guggenheim Fellowship, which is a very prestigious monetary award, to travel to Europe to work on her next novel. However, her career is derailed by a plagiarism scandal. She was said to have plagiarized some passages in a short story she published, and this led to a decline in her reputation in the literary world. And then with the Great Depression, the bottom kind of dropped out of the literary market, and the boom in Harlem kind of came to an end. So she left the literary world. She went back to work as a nurse until her death in 1964, and unfortunately her works were forgotten for most of the middle of the 20th century. Even though she made a great debut and was very widely reviewed, Quicksand was her first novel, her works were forgotten in the mid-20th century. But then, in the aftermath of events we'll discuss later in this course, the civil rights movement, the feminist movement, in which there was a great interest in recovering the works of forgotten writers who were African American or who were women or who were both, her works were rediscovered in, let's say, about the 70s and 80s. And now she's very widely taught. She's considered central to the Harlem Renaissance, central to modernism. So it's a very sad story that has happened to a number of artists and writers throughout history, which is that she died, I think, thinking she had been forgotten. And so it's a shame she didn't live to know that we would be talking about her and we would all be reading her work. So with that in mind, I would ask you and urge you to read the first 2/3. I think I said up to chapter 17 of Quicksand by our next lecture, and have it finished by the time of the lecture after next. I will rejoin you for our next lecture, in which I will discuss Quicksand in some detail. Thanks very much. Have a great day.